Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Policy Committee meeting for Tuesday, August 21st. We are joined by my Vice Chair, Mr. Madden. Our teacher representative unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, and we'll be joined by Dr. Babson and Mr. Batchelor shortly, but our administrative liaison, Dr. Rabarchik's here, as is our solicitor, Mr. Diazio. So, Dr. Rabarchik, here we go. Could you please give us some administrative remarks to get started?
Sure. Just to note, the questions from the public comment at the August 14th policy meeting, those questions and the questions from today's meeting for public comment will be responded to at the September meeting. Also, in addition, there are minutes from our August 14th meeting, since it was just last week. They will also be reviewed and approved at the September meeting. As per our recent practice of the committee, a description of the work being done at the policy meeting is noted on the agenda and at the box at the top of each accompanying document. As a matter of general context for tonight, all but one of the policies being presented shall be impacted by recent changes due to state and/or federal laws. The one exception is Policy 272, Student Wellness. This policy is being brought forth for review because of the recent work done to it by state law mandated by the District Wellness Committee. I'd also like to announce that in recent days, administration has completed and posted, or soon to be there, the following administrative regulations: 204 attendance, 907 school visitors that are meant to accompany the respective policies. In addition, the following ARs will be posted to the district's website prior to the start of the school year, which are being introduced to school administration: AR 121 curriculum-related field trips and AR 210 use of medications.
Great, thank you, Dr. Rabarchik. And given that we don't have minutes for tonight, we will move right to public comment if there is any, but please come forward. Good evening, Dr. Winters.
Good evening. Good evening, Roberta Winters, 326 Williams Road. My questions have to deal with Board Policy 272 on board wellness and the inclusion of information in it. While I think nutrition and social and emotional growth and physical well-being are important, I think that the issue of sleep is not in there, and it should be somewhere. Those words should be mentioned as an important part of wellness, because even the military recognizes that physical exercise, nutrition, and sleep are the three significant components of wellness. And I do not see sleep issued, and I think given what we know today, it should be included somewhere in that policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Winters. Any other public comment? Good evening, Mrs. Sherry.
Good evening. This meeting was labeled Part 2 in, I guess, the front page of the website. And I don't quite understand that. I think it's a separate meeting. You finished everything on your first meeting. There was no new business. It's fine to have two meetings of the policy committee. So I didn't understand why this is considered Part 2. I am disappointed to hear that some of the questions that were raised at the last meeting will go unanswered until September. Some of them were pretty straightforward questions with just a yes and a no answer, like Dr. Winter's questions about other groups being included with the discussion with Mr. Friel. I think when things can be straightened out, rather than waiting a whole month and you have another meeting of a whole week to gather some answers together, that would be the way that seems like an efficient meeting. Because oftentimes after a month, it's hard to remember exactly what the issues were. So tonight, because I think it's my understanding that the Booster Club policy and, I don't know, I guess the regulations don't have to come forward, is coming forward at the business meeting. Am I correct about that? So I still have lingering questions that apply to that policy. And one of them is, what if you just don't want to pay the Booster Club's fee? Does that mean your child is eliminated because you didn't pay the cost? So does that mean your child can't participate in that activity? And is the board satisfied with the contradictory administration regulation that states fundraising cannot be required, yet fees can be required, since fees are a form of fundraising? Then at the last week's meeting, I heard varsity club sport. I don't know what is the meaning of this category? In the past, a sport was either varsity or a club sport. So that's a new name. And again, if a booster club decides it doesn't want to turn in its finances, what are the consequences of those actions? And my final one additional question. Well, actually, one question and one comment. Will the administration send an amended Title IX report to the state and add on the additional funds raised by the football booster club during the years this income wasn't reported? So I was thinking, like, just with your taxes, if you make a mistake, you can send in amended form. And it seems like we should be doing that. And finally, at the June 19th Policy Committee meeting, the status of ice hockey as a varsity sport was discussed, and Mr. Batchelor stated, quote, "You voted it to be a club sport," unquote. Board members refuted that assertion, and members of the public have repeatedly stated that ice hockey is a varsity sport, pathetically funded compared to the costs of the athletes involved. For the record, I have board minutes from June 22nd, 2004. Here are 2 copies where it was voted unanimously by the board to make ice hockey a varsity sport with a number of guidelines. What is the best way of publicizing this information so that future administrations, board members, and the parents and the public can find it easily? Because this was actually partially an election issue. You know, the ice hockey sent things to prospective people running for office and asked whether or not they would agree to having them become a varsity sport. It was a pretty hot issue. There were people at every meeting. And so here is the record of it. I have 2 copies, and I'd like to know where it can be placed so that in the future people can access it, and so there's no confusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public?
Where
Excuse
should I
me.
give this? To you, Madam Chair?
Yes, just be careful of the wires, please. Thank you. Okay, so let's move into our agenda, which begins with Policy 628, Federal Fiscal Compliance. And I guess because this has been explained in our agenda, I assume my committee members understand the changes that we're proposing and why. The one thing I'd like to address with our administrative liaison is the fact that the primary change that we're making is a change to the bid thresholds. Those have been addressed in the AR as opposed to the policy, and the AR was not attached, so I've asked if you could please share with us a little bit description of what those changes to the bid thresholds are.
Yes, and I just want to point out, I made copies of those with the red lines to show where they were changes.
Oh, they're over there?
Over there, yes.
Okay, we don't have them over here. Mr. Diazio?
Sure. So the changes to the bid thresholds come every year, and if there's an adjustment, it's announced at the beginning of the year, usually the final week in December. And so for 2018, one of the previous thresholds of $19,400, which is the former threshold as to when competitive bidding was required, that number, or that threshold for that matter, increased to $20,100. So that was the primary reason that we brought the policy under consideration. The committee may remember a few months back we dealt with a very similar policy, the procurement policy, and at that time we made the changes to the bid thresholds and realized after the fact that policy 628 needed to have corresponding changes made as well.
Okay, great. So you'll notice, committee members, if you didn't already, that there are multiple ARs that support policy 628, and within each AR, the bid threshold has been addressed to become current. So the board, of course, does not approve administrative regulations, but because that's where the change occurred, we wanted you to see them so that you would know the connection between the change and the documents. Does anybody have any questions Well, of course, you can raise questions about the AR, but short of having a question about the AR, does anybody have any questions or proposed changes to policy 628? Because as long as we're changing the AR, it's an opportunity to look at the policy as well. So, Dr. Babson.
Pretty straightforward question. Why, just looking at number 2 there, just looking at number 2, it says the board designates business administrators crossed out and then superintendent is inserted. And so just a quick description of that rationale.
Sure.
I think at the direction of the committee, it's been decided that when there's delegation to any administrator, the board should delegate to the superintendent. And if the superintendent chooses to further delegate out, that's within the discretion of the superintendent. And so usually we use the term superintendent or designee.
There are very rare instances where by law it has to be a specific administrator, but short of that, some time back, we decided to give the superintendent more flexibility. You never know how your administration is going to be staffed, so this way the superintendent always has the opportunity to assign whomever to have that authority.
Sure,
Is
makes
that
sense.
helpful?
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Madden,
no,
any
I'm
questions? Okay. There was one from our committee member who isn't here today, had written in requesting a word change or two on 628. Mrs. Stern wanted to request in section number 2 of delegation of responsibility, the third sentence, that it read, the superintendent to assist in the proper administration of federal funds and implementation of this policy shall develop administrative regulations, and instead of the word implementing, she's requesting the use of the word for, F-O-R, so that it would read administrative regulations for this policy in accordance with applicable law. Does anybody have any objection to that word change? Nope. Okay, so could we make note of that change in time for next week? And then the other word change request she had was on page 2, number 4, where it says internal controls. In the third line, it says all such property and must assure, A-S-S-U-R-E, that it is used. And she would like assure to be changed to ensure, E-N-S-U-R-E. Does anybody have any objections to that word change? Okay, so folks, if we could make those changes, we will be ready. The plan is to take these forward next week at our business meeting for a first read. And I think we're ready to do that and move on to our next agenda item. Okay, next agenda item is policy 217, which is graduation requirements. Again, I'm not sure that this was in the exact description. Wanted to say that as part of the change to school code, the Keystone exams as a graduation requirement were delayed yet another year, and the solicitor update suggested that that may have policy implications. And although I don't think it does for our particular district, it did give us an opportunity as we were looking through policy 217 to recognize that there might be other changes that needed to be made. So I think Mr. Bechtold and Mr. Diazio, Dr. Rabarchek got together and worked on 217. And so the changes that you see in the red line version of 217 are the changes that were made to the policy based on their review. And we'd like to move this forward to our meeting next week also for a first read. So given that description, does anybody, start with you, Dr. Babson, have any questions on policy 217 or its accompanying administrative regulation?
I don't at this time.
How about you, Mr. Madden? You do not. Okay, so I do have a couple of questions on behalf of Mrs. Stern in terms of the policy. When it comes to authority, I think it's the 1, 2, 3, 4th statement down. It says a list of all graduating students shall be submitted to the board for its information and released to the public. And her question was, when does this happen? So would like to present that question.
Sure, and based on this information and talking with our district solicitor as well, there's not enough time in between the time when final exams come to a conclusion and the time that graduation occurs. So basically, this statement can be stricken from the policy itself. It does not need to be included.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that answer. And her question on page 2, under delegation of responsibility, number 4, it says that the superintendent or designee shall be responsible for preparing the diplomas of all graduating students and submitting a list of candidates eligible for the award of a diploma to the board for its approval. When does the approval happen, was her question.
Yes, this is another one where it's not quite an approval and we can strike for its approval, but at the graduation ceremony itself, Mr. Bechtel and Mr. Batchelor present the graduates along with their diplomas at that time to the board.
Mr. Diazio?
Sure, and just to further clarify that, the board sets the graduation requirements for the district, and any students that meet those requirements are then eligible to graduate. So it's not that the board is giving up any oversight here, it's just that it plays out a little bit differently than the way in which it was worded in the policy as drafted.
Correct. Okay. So at this point, in terms of the policy, we are requesting 2 changes for next week. One would be the elimination of that sentence on page 1 that isn't required. And on page 2, we're going to remove the words "for its approval" for number 4 under delegation of responsibility. Also wanted to just briefly mention, it looks like there's one other change to school code that occurred that did impact this policy, and that was about the awarding of diplomas to veterans. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that language has been inserted into the administrative regulation to address that, as well as the policy.
Okay. And the administrative regulation didn't come in red line, so does that mean that the administrative regulation is new, or it remains the same?
It's a new administrative regulation. And just to clarify, the provision in the law about the award of diplomas to veterans, that's not necessarily a new requirement, but it's something that has not been memorialized previously in policy, and so we decided to put it in here to match what would be local procedure.
Terrific. Okay. So we're going to forward both of these documents to the full board again, knowing that only the policy requires board approval, but the administrative regulation often is helpful to see so that it gives you the full scope of the policy. Any questions from anybody before we move on to our next agenda item? I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Where?
Fourth paragraph, under authority, on the first page, the third paragraph after authority, shall be allotted a certificate of attendance. Needs an R. Third paragraph after authority, second to last line.
Are you looking at the policy or the administrative regulation?
Let me look.
Policy.
I don't have that.
It's right. It's in the red line. It's
Oh, in
awarded.
the red line.
Yep,
Okay, because in the clean version, it's properly spelled.
Oh,
correct.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Looking at the red line.
That's okay.
And
That's-
sometimes what happens is when you click on the red line document and accept all of the changes, then Microsoft Word actually shows you where the spelling errors were.
Right.
And so every once in a while that does happen.
Just
Thank you for pointing that out.
Just wait till we get to 272, right? And then we'll really see that in action. Okay. Next agenda item is Policy 6, Meetings and Public Participation. Again, hope you guys are recognizing that we put the rationale for why we are reviewing these policies on the agenda and in the box on the document so that we don't have to spend too much time in the meeting actually explaining the rationale. In short, this is one of those changes to school code that occurred, and you will note that the change occurred in the executive session section of the policy, listing what it is that qualifies for executive session, and it has to do with the new state law that we can discuss safety and security within a certain scope in executive session. So we've inserted that into the policy, and we'd like to bring it forward next week as well for a first read. Does anybody have any questions, fellow committee members? You guys are just Delightful. Okay. Thank you. All right. And then we are going to move on to Policy 138, which is currently called Limited English Proficiency Program. Say that 4 times in a row. And this, again, is one of those that needed to be updated to become in compliance with the federal Every Student Succeeds Act.
Correct.
So I would like to ask the committee if you have any questions about either the policy or the accompanying administrative regulation. Please note that there is a proposed change to the title, so that, will that appear for the first read as the original title with the proposed change of title as part of the approval process? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Dr. Babson, do you have any questions about that policy or administrative regulation? And Mr. Madden, do you? Okay, I do have a couple. I have a question from myself, and I believe Mrs. Stern had a question she turned into us as well. My question was for purpose and authority. Typically, we separate out purpose and authority. They're not usually clumped together. So I was wondering what was the thinking behind that?
Yes, this was something that was just combined together when rewriting the purpose and including authority embedded into it. So it's just the purpose, and the and authority as part of that title will be stricken.
Okay. Sounds good. And the questions that I am raising on behalf of Mrs. Stern are that under the newly titled section purpose, if you go down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line, the sentence says, the goal of the program, the goal of the LIEP is to demonstrate success in increasing. And she wanted to know if it could be worded as demonstrate improvement in the English language proficiency. She thought that demonstrating improvement in is a more effective way to say demonstrate, or more concise way, demonstrate success in increasing. So does anybody have an objection to rewording that way?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy. Can you repeat that question? The goal of the LIEP is to demonstrate success in increasing the English language proficiency and academic achievement of ELs, which is English learners. She would like to say the goal of the LIEP is to demonstrate improvement in English language proficiency and academic achievement of English learners. Do you have an objection to that change in words?
Thinking about it, success and improvement is a big difference. I mean, I can improve and still not be successful. I mean, is success something that we're looking for, or improvement? So.
Well, it's not just demonstrate success, it's demonstrate success in increasing or improving. So I guess it would come down to, is increasing different from improving? Right?
Increasing proficiency versus improving proficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there a difference? We could always leave this into next week, and then Susan can raise it again there she can pull it and raise it, and maybe it'll give you guys a little extra time to noodle on the...
I mean, logically, it's basically the same thing. I mean, proficiency means that you're adept at something. So if you increase your adeptness, that means you're increasing your skill.
Your skill. Yeah, I'm sorry. You have to say that all over again.
Sorry. It's logically the same thing, or it's so similar that it would be good to ask Susan what she was driving at. Maybe she was driving at something more substantial, a more substantial difference. But logically speaking, it's really pretty similar.
Okay. So.
Go ahead.
English learners are put in a program that they have to have successfully completed to not be in that list.
Right.
You don't
Right.
have a microphone.
I
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
Right.
So I don't know if that makes a difference in your word.
Well, why don't we do this? Let's leave it. You know, Susan's not here to represent her concern firsthand. Let's leave it the way it is. And perhaps Dr. Rabarchek, you can reach out to her and let her know, so she understands that we didn't ignore her request and that we just thought it deserved her firsthand explanation next week, okay?
Correct.
Yeah, because it does seem increasing is a verb that you can measure in a sense. Improvement, you can measure, but it's not used as much.
More vague.
Yeah, in education language. Good point.
Okay, so that, I guess, so we'll be moving this policy forward next week for a first read with stricken and authority in the beginning. That change in one word, we did agree, or no, we didn't agree on her word.
No,
Oh, she had one
either
other
way.
question.
Yep,
Forgive me.
I was just going to say one more.
She said on page 1, the last paragraph states, "The superintendent or designee, in conjunction with appropriate stakeholders, shall develop and disseminate administrative regulations," and so forth. And she wanted to know why "in conjunction with appropriate stakeholders" was added in there, because typically we don't include that, even though oftentimes we do convene stakeholders to help us inform our policy.
And this would be a perfect example of when the stakeholders would be involved in working in conjunction with them and developing program, because this Title III is through federal programs funding, so it is required by law to bring in stakeholders to look at the program, review it, make sure that it's meeting the needs of our students.
That's helpful. So is there any way that we could just throw in there in conjunction with appropriate Title III stakeholders or something like that? Something along those lines to illustrate what you just said, because that was helpful.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily Title III stakeholders, because they're not necessarily part of the Title III population, but maybe you want to.
Something in that realm.
So maybe the superintendent or designee, in conjunction with appropriate stakeholders as per Title III requirements, shall develop and disseminate administrative regulations. Does that seem reasonable? And in our reference section, we probably have Title III cited in there, don't we?
Third bullet point. Mm-hmm. Which I think is, you could even say per the.
Typically, the only issue with that is typically we don't source our references, refer to our references at this point in our policies. So, you know, but if it's a matter of it being unclear,
Clarity.
we can always take it out in our second read. So maybe that helps Susan better understand why the stakeholders are in there. Mm-hmm. And if because she's the one who also raises the concern about referencing the legal references in the body of the policy, she can decide, right?
Do you mind just reading through that again? The superintendent or designee, in conjunction with appropriate stakeholders as per Title III requirements, and then shall develop. Okay. Just want to make sure I read it.
Does that make sense in terms?
It does. I just want to make sure I got everything.
Okay.
I think so.
All right. So I believe that is it as far as concerns for the policy and the administrative regulation. So this will be ready to be moved forward. There were a couple comments on commas on page 2, actually in the last. Just above the legal references, ELD programs and services to students attending private schools shall be provided only if and only to the extent required by law. She wanted the 2 commas in there to know if they were absolutely necessary in reading it. You want to leave it and she can raise it again?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right, terrific. So let's move on to our final agenda item of the evening, and that is Policy 272, Wellness. And again, as Dr. Rabarchik mentioned, this is the only one that isn't being changed as a result of very recent changes to state or federal law. It's being changed because the Wellness Committee
met.
As mandated by law, has met, and then within their purview is the opportunity to review this policy and bring forth recommendations. You'll see the revisions to this policy reflect their proposed changes to it. So I'd like to see if the committee has any questions regarding Policy 272. Dr. Babson?
No.
No questions for it?
I guess the only question that I did have, because we did have
Public comment?
Public comment. Dr. Roberta brought up, Dr. Winters, about the sleep, and if you were going to put something like that in there, where would that be? Would that be in the policy? Would that be in the AR, or?
Our solicitor looks like he has a.
I think the fact that there is a wellness committee, the wellness committee is not necessarily limited to discussing topics which are specifically called out in this policy.
Okay.
The committee can certainly take up any wellness-related item. So, sleep is something that's, under a lot of study right now. And,
Right.
if there's work that the committee can do on that front moving forward, I think it's appropriate, and I think this policy would still allow discussion on sleep, regardless of whether it's called out or not in the policy itself. The policy that Radnor's adopting is, obviously there have been a few customizations to it, but it tracks very closely the model wellness policy that's on PDE's website. And schools are required under the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act to have this wellness policy and to convene a wellness committee. This policy complies with those laws, but there's nothing to say that at some time in the future, if the district wants to expand the scope of the committee, that they can't do that. And I don't think this policy limits you in your ability to do that.
So I guess what could be considered is a recommendation maybe from the public about where sleep might fit in terms of the policy, and the committee could consider that and decide either yes or no. There's no reason it can't be in there. It's more about, and there's no question that there's no way that conversation about sleep is precluded or anything else related to wellness. It's a matter of whether or not it's specifically mentioned in the policy. So where in the policy it would go would be helpful in terms of those people who want to put it in.
One of the other things to keep in mind, one of the other requirements is that the district takes steps to inform the public about how to contact the wellness committee.
Right.
So if the district's considering doing any outreach or anything like that to the community about how to contact the wellness committee or suggest topics, perhaps there can be a discussion about how word will get out to the community.
And that's one of the things, and unfortunately, we were in retreat all day, administrative retreat. So Mr. Petiti and I had a conversation, though. We are going to have, by the week end, a website under the webpage under the community section of our website that will be for just wellness, the student wellness policy in reference to it, and it'll be under construction, but we will start adding the information, especially when this gets approved. Obviously, a lot of this information is going to be transferred into that area.
Right, I appreciate your mentioning that, because part of the policy or the administrative regulation, I guess, requires record keeping and communication with the public about the activities of the Wellness Committee and
Correct.
the triannual review, et cetera. So a web page is one of the best ways to make sure that it's available to anybody who wants to access it on any time, day or night. There'll be other communication, I'm sure, but
Yes,
the web page will be
absolutely.
for sure one way. Do you guys have any other questions on either the policy or the administrative regulation?
Well, going back to the sleep piece, part is that in our curriculum, do you know?
It's not directly, it's just overall just good hygiene is basically what's part of the curriculum that is taught in the wellness classes.
Well, actually, I think we just adopted a whole bunch of new health textbooks.
Correct.
And one of the reasons why that particular textbook was chosen was because it has sleep in it. So I think there was a very intentional
It's just not at every grade level is what I'm saying.
I think it might be in every.
I can go back and check.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's something to check, but I'm pretty sure I heard that sleep is now embedded in each of
Okay.
the textbooks.
Yeah, in other words, we say curriculum and programs for, the grades K to 12 that are designed to educate students
What
about.
page are you on? Where are you?
Page 1
and
and 2,
Okay,
number 4.
okay.
About proper nutrition, sleep, and lifelong physical activity, because actually what Dr. Winter said, those are the three components that the government is now saying, make up wellness. You have to you have to have nutrition, you have to sleep, and physical activity. Plus, you have to be able to breathe.
Yes.
So that's just a thought. I'm not saying that they're kicking that out there for thought. And then maybe when we bring it forward, we can know more about if it is in our curriculum, then why not?
No, I'll check with Dr. Kent tomorrow, who's our supervisor of health and wellness.
That would be great. And before we make the recommendation to put that in, can we also just run that by Mr. Batchelor?
Yes.
And get his feedback? And it's certainly, if that more advocacy for it, maybe next week, if people still feel strongly about it, someone can pull this policy and there can be discussion about it before the first reading is concluded. So, other than that?
No, other than that, I'm fine.
There's only one other topic that I'd like to bring up. It's not relevant to the I'm still learning the relationship between the policy and the administrative, the AR. But something about under nutrition promotion in the AR on page 3, there is the phrase research-based, which is good, under nutrition promotion. But I think it would be good to have the idea of scientifically based or research-based to apply to everything that we do about student health and wellness. So possibly have that phrase or some phrase like it in the policy. So scientifically based or research-based, I think, is very important no matter what we do for health and wellness of students. So I'm glad to see that that phrase, second paragraph under nutrition promotion on page 3. District food service personnel shall review and implement research-based techniques, et cetera. That's good. But I think that no matter what we do with health and wellness for students, that it should be scientifically research-based. And that is, we see that in our discussions, our public discussions about school start times and our concern with whether or not students are ready to go, given their stage in adolescent development that requires more sleep.
I almost see that, and we can have more discussion about it, but if you
Sure.
go back to the policy, then within the purpose itself, within the first sentence there, of adding something that identifies that it's research-based or scientifically based.
I think that would be very helpful to have that on the policy level so that the AR would then align with that as it's elaborated.
Well,
Additionally, if you look at the AR, on page 2 of the AR, the second paragraph under Radnor Township School District Wellness Committee, you'll see that the Wellness Committee shall review and consider, so this is their task, evidence-based strategies and techniques for nutrition education, nutrition promotion, physical activity, and other school-based activities. And then as you continue through the AR, nutrition education, nutrition promotion, physical activity, and other school-based activities are included. So it's included in a few spots, but perhaps.
But incorporated into
into
the
the
policy would make more sense.
so
I mean, just so it aligns.
Where do you think would be the appropriate place if we, I mean, purpose for, I think makes sense, but where in the purpose, unless maybe you disagree about purpose, but if you were going to insert it there, where would you put it?
Maybe in the second sentence of the purpose, the board is committed to providing a school environment that promotes student wellness, proper nutrition, nutrition education, and regular physical activity as part of the total learning experience. Somehow maybe at the end of that sentence, in accordance with research and evidence-based techniques or something like that.
Yeah, some language along those lines. Even under authority, to give it a little more, I guess, impetus. To ensure the health and well-being of all students, the board establishes that the district shall provide to students in accordance with State Board of Education curriculum regulations and academic standards. I know it's a mouthful already.
Right.
But, and also in line with the latest and, best-known scientific findings on.
Well, authority is really meant to direct who's the one responsible for the execution and
Right, so that
implementation of the
purpose
policy, so I
seems to
really
be-
Okay.
think it's probably
purpose.
a better
Okay.
fit in the purpose. It's just a matter of in which sentence. if you were going to use the second sentence, you could say the board is committed to providing a school environment that promotes research-based, evidence-based, whatever it is. You could put it in there or at the end of that sentence. So do you guys want to maybe,
We'll propose.
not
We'll
under the
propose
gun,
it.
yeah,
Yep.
you know, work out that little issue there in the purpose? And the wording would be, I imagine, would be consistent with the wording in the AR, how you refer to it as research-based evidence, whatever the combination of words, evidence-based strategies and techniques, or research-based something, right? Okay, so at least we're consistent between policy and administrative regulation.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, so, anything else, Dr. Babson? No? Okay, well, thank you both for those contributions. Under authority, I do have a proposal for number 1, where it says a comprehensive nutrition program. I was confused as to whether or not initially, and I could have been sleepy, whether that was curricular-based or food meal-based. And upon further investigation, I was told it's kind of both. So would it be possible to say a comprehensive food and nutrition program consistent with federal and state requirements?
Yes, we can add that in.
Okay,
on
super.
Number 1.
I also thought that 3 was a little bit redundant with 4, and was wondering if we could just jump from 2 to 3, where it says curriculum and programs for grades K through 12 that are designed to educate students about proper nutrition and lifelong physical activity, because those programs could be physical education courses or not, so
Yes, and we can
it gives
strike
us a little
number
bit more
3.
flexibility. So you would strike number 3?
Sure.
Again, you know, sleep perhaps would be something
Considered to
somebody
be.
would consider raising next week, unless you want to put it in now. It's just different. I'd rather hear the whole board's feedback on that.
So if you want their feedback, do you want that included then? Or, because that would be,
Vice Chair, what do you think?
Yeah, I would put it in.
put it in?
Yeah, why not put it in, and then if they don't
If it
like
needs to be taken out, we have a second read.
Okay.
so-
Discuss it then, but if we can come up with that, the definition that Dr. Winters told us, so that we have some ammunition when somebody says, why are you putting that in? Because that's part of the definition of wellness. If somebody can find that, I would like to have that.
Well, maybe in our final public comment, Dr. Winters can cite the source of that.
I think I can get online.
Okay, well, you have a little time. Let us finish this, and then we can come back to that. Number 4 would be social, emotional, and mental health services to safeguard student wellness. I'm proposing to remove the words in these areas because I just think they're unnecessary. Does anybody have any objection to that?
Can you, again, refer, to, Amy, to where you're
Number
talking?
4, under authority, the last bullet point, the last one, which used to be 5, but now will be 4. Social, emotional, and mental health services to safeguard student wellness.
Yeah, it is redundant.
Yeah,
In these areas.
to
Okay.
take in these areas out.
You take that out?
Yes. I just wanted to also mention for those who were looking at the red line in addition to the clean version, that if you really want to see what how technology can mess you up, you will notice, as I did, that there is a sentence in the red line version of the policy that did not make it into the clean version. But apparently, that's for good reason, because and that sentence was, the designee, in the red line version, page 2, the designee shall annually report to the board on the district's compliance with law and policies related to student wellness. The report may include : and then there was nothing really after that. And I think there's an explanation for why it didn't make it into the clean version.
Yes, so when we received the original red-lined version of the policy back from the Wellness Committee, it was in a PDF format that formatting was thrown off, and the first line what you just read, Ms. Goldman, the designee shall annually report to the Board of Directors. Compliance was also in the same line as the top box. So it looked like it was crossed out, but then you couldn't tell if it was actually crossed out. So it is.
Need that sentence.
We do not need that sentence. We only need the part with.
Why do we not need that sentence? Because the designee doesn't have to annually report to the board?
Correct. And the way it was rewritten in regards to the policy itself, the superintendent or designee shall be responsible to establish administrative regulations to monitor school districts, programs, and curriculum to ensure compliance. So that's where this piece comes in, the compliance with this board policy and applicable law, and to incorporate recommendations from the district wellness committee established by this policy. So the top of page 2 is, part of that was converted into that explanation.
Because there isn't a reporting requirement as
Correct.
per law.
Correct.
Solicitor?
Correct.
Okay.
There's not an annual requirement.
Okay, so we're not missing anything. In
No,
fact,
we're not.
it's not that we're not missing anything.
We
To
actually
have that in there
made it more
is not
clear.
a valid requirement. So
Correct.
we needed to take that out. Okay. The other question on the policy that came from Mrs. Stern was that under guidelines, she requested a word change in the second sentence. That's where it says that the committee will be comprised of at least one representative of the following groups. She would like the word "of" changed to "from." Committee, do you have any objections to changing "of" to "from"?
Where are you looking
Right here.
at? Okay.
A representative from the following groups as opposed to a representative of the following groups.
Sure. And this is something that I might mention a number of times, but it's something that I ask my students to reconsider all the time, is comprising means including. So I'm not a fan. So you could change it to composed, or the board shall ensure that it continues as a district wellness committee comprising at least one, or composed of. It's just it's one of my pet peeves.
So what would you like a change to?
It could just be comprise at least one.
Comprising? No.
The board shall ensure the
Compose.
continued existence of a district wellness committee comprising at least one.
Okay,
Yeah,
comprising.
yeah. Again, it's just something that,
You sure about that now, right?
I'm 100% sure.
Okay. All right, great. One other thing I wanted to mention is in the legal references, it looks like we're missing several of them. So I would just,
Yes.
just ask that list be
Yes, once again,
reestablished.
based off of the old formatted PDF that came through, it didn't copy over. So we will
Okay.
be sure to include those references.
Okay, that sounds good. And just wanted in the AR to make a comment about page 5 of the administrative regulation. There is a statement there about Act 55 of 2017, and it goes on to talk about, for lack of a better word, the whole food shaming issue. And given that that act was revised in 2018, it drew my attention that we were citing the act from the previous year as opposed to citing it for 2018. And then I started to think, well, maybe it doesn't even belong in this policy, because talk about food shaming and restrictions on charging meals, et cetera, really belongs perhaps in our food services
Food service,
policy?
correct. So we
So-
can easily strike that from this AR.
Okay.
And I also ran that by with Dr. Kane today as well. And he was
Okay.
in agreement.
Okay, so then for the AR, even though we don't have to approve it,
Right.
we're going to strike
That last paragraph.
Yes, and
on
I'm
page
sorry to
5.
go backwards here, but on
Okay.
page 2 of the administrative regulation, is it possible to underline wellness policy assessment and communication to the public, just to make it stand out a little bit more from the rest of the text? I know you probably don't want to put it in all caps, or maybe you do, but see how all the other sections are in all capitals and that one isn't? But it's a really important section, so would it be?
Underline it? That's fine with everyone, because it falls under that Radnor Township School District Wellness
Wellness
Committee
Committee.
site. So
Okay,
I
so
can
if you
just
could
underline that.
it? Okay, that would be helpful, thank you. And then I had a question from Mrs. Stern. she had asked about, in the AR, the opening paragraph, she was wondering if we should be stating all the forms of wellness as the opening salvo that we also state in our policy, if that could be reworded, because it only says to promote the health and wellness by encouraging good nutrition and regular physical activity, and we had included social and emotional learning in our policy. She was wondering if that could be fleshed out a little bit so that that statement covers the same topics in the AR that are addressed in the purpose of the policy.
Yeah, we can work on in the wording of that to make sure everything's included.
Okay, and then there were a number of notes here about capitalization. And on page 2 of the administrative regulation, under wellness policy assessment and communication to the public, she wanted to know in number 2, where it says compares to model wellness policies, which model, for example, would be a solid comparison.
Right, and this was in reference to the Pennsylvania Department of Education model, so we will cite that within the AR.
Okay, so you would
Prior
describe
to-
it as compares to the Pennsylvania Department of
Department of Ed
Education model wellness policy?
Correct.
Okay, because if it's just that, do they only have one policy? Because we would
Yeah,
need to make that
yes.
singular,
Yep.
too. It would need to say,
They do only have one.
the extent to which this policy and administrative regulation compares to the, insert the word the, Pennsylvania Department of Education model wellness policy. I don't even know if you need the word model.
I know, now I'm thinking,
The,
may not. The-
solicitor?
The Pennsylvania Department of
PDE
Education.
refers to the policy on their website as the model
Oh, do
wellness
they
policy.
really?
Their model wellness policy.
Interesting.
Can we put it in quotes? PDE's model wellness policy?
You can, if you'd like.
Sounds a little odd, but let's.
Does sound odd.
Does sound odd.
Okay, well, let's do it so it's consistent that way.
Okay.
If anybody asks, we now know the answering. She
That's
has
right.
on page 4 some alignment questions
Yes.
under social, emotional, and mental health services, some more capitalization things, and I think,
And if I can just reference quickly,
Sure.
Amy, on page 6 and 7, the fundraisers involving food and the list that is included with there, that would be part of on the website as well. So people are fully aware. You know, we're going to have a link to the AR, but I think some of this has to be spelled out specifically on that website.
I would
when
go a
it's
step
developed.
further and say, is it true that that's going to be added into this year's
Student handbooks as well, so
And
we'll
maybe
put a
just
notice
leave
out
it-
when it's,
Would you consider maybe having that as a PTO coordinate, it's not called the coordinating council anymore, but since this is so much about parents and what they can and can't bring into classrooms, that maybe you want to talk to Dr. McGuigan as the administrative liaison to the PTOs?
yes, we both are, so I can bring that up. We
So
both go.
that you put that
Yep.
on a very soon PTO meeting
Mm-hmm.
of the president, so that they are aware of this and can disseminate the information from there?
Yep.
That would be great, because I don't think that they are aware of these nutrition guidelines that have to do with classroom snacks and classroom celebrations and stuff like
Sure.
that. So that would be great. Okay, so, good work, everybody. Is there any new business? Oh, and by the way, that moves on for first read, wellness.
Correct.
Okay. Is there any new business?
Amy, before the train keeps moving, I was just taking another look at the suggestions for healthy food celebrations. There are a number of items on that list that look pretty dubious. The latest research on low-fat items is that actually
Which
Often-
page? Show me which page you're on.
we're on page 8.
The very last page.
Very last page. The latest research about low-fat items is that they're often loaded with tons of salt and sugar, and that actually many kinds of fat are not as bad as has been touted by many food production organizations. I wish I could be more specific on that one. But the point is that I'm wondering, is this list up for debate? How important is it to have such a list in this document?
I don't think it's actually up for debate, but I will check with Dr. Kane again and Barbara Nitzel, who's our food service coordinator.
Yeah.
But this is a list that comes out specifically to her from the federal government. I know that. So, because a lot of these things are sold in the cafeterias as well.
I see. Well, again, I mean, this goes in line with what I was saying earlier, that
About research.
the latest, I'm just talking about my knowledge of the latest research on
Sure.
these issues. And certainly no one's going to say eat as much fat as you want, but there's been a lot of very significant research that's come out over the past year or two that said that low-fat snacks and foods are actually loaded with tons of salt and sugar. And so it should be considered perhaps more closely. It's just something that I thought I would throw in.
But I can take that back to Ms. Nissel as well,
that
so
would be
she's
wonderful.
aware.
Yeah, why don't you make a note of that, and then perhaps what you might want to do is raise the question next week or something, or
Sure.
see if there's, what Ms. Nissel had to say about it.
Yeah, that would be
So,
good.
to piggyback on that, is there a difference? Is there a federal guideline, not only for the cafeteria, but is there a federal guideline for celebrations in the classroom? Well, this is
This is where it gets tricky.
One thing that I was seeing, Chuck, in this document, there's something called the USDA Smart Snacks in School, and I was looking at that, because I'm on the internet here with my phone, I've got my materials electronically here, so I just took a quick look. There's a document here that was published in 2016, and, there's a process whereby you go by federal guidelines and you adhere to them, and that is a process, but at the same time, as a school district, I assume that we have quite a bit of latitude about how we respond to those guidelines. And so it would make sense for us to be as smart as possible about this.
Sure.
And to really consider what is best for students. And there's another issue here that was actually separate to this, but in the previous page about advertising and marketing. Is that something that, how are we thinking about that in a smart and conscientious way, about who advertises and markets to our kids and how? I guess these are just issues that are of concern to me.
Sure.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, we have, the data's out there. The low-fat industry caused issues for a generation. So I agree, we need to look into that.
Does it make sense, because we have a section on advertising and marketing? I mean, we do have a policy on that. I'm not sure if that's cited in 272 or not, or needs to be, but.
The advertising piece that's mentioned here in the 272 AR, this is a requirement of law, this paragraph. The list on page 8, this is not a list that was created internally here in Radnor.
Correct.
This came from, from the federal government. That said, I do know there's ongoing discussion about, and the lists do change for some of the reasons that you've noted. One other question I did hear about the classroom celebrations and things like that, the requirement is to have a policy. The school district has some discretion to determine what the policy is, but there's a requirement to have a policy. And so that's why those are included in this AR.
And there is a movement to have classroom celebrations that don't include food.
Correct, and I can speak
Which
for
is
the
what-
elementary.
right.
We highly encourage
Right.
the birthday celebrations or any type of celebrations, that it be a birthday book that brought into the classroom or some type of game for an indoor recess time. So we really do try, as the administration with the elementary schools, avoid the food piece.
Right. Okay.
All right, well, I guess just in the administrative regulation, is it clear that where these are coming from, whether they're coming from the district or coming from law?
Yeah, we should note that.
So we'll cite those. I'll talk to Mr. Kane and Barb Nissel again, or Dr. Kane and
So
Barb
for each
Nissel again.
section, can we just identify where those regulations come from, please, before next week?
Yeah,
So-
that's a good point. I mean, even though it's mentioned sort of in between the lines in the document itself, perhaps just a tiny, like as Amy's saying, a tiny little, 6-point font or
Sure.
something underneath the source, that'd be good.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll reach out to Dr. Kane and Barb Nissel tonight.
Okay, so we'll see some difference in those documents. I think we covered all of that for 272.
Correct.
You guys know what changes need to be made for next week's meeting. And with that, thank you, everybody, for your
Thank you.
contributions. It was a lengthy agenda, and we did a great job of getting through that work. So let's have our final public comment.
Oh, you found it, right? All right. Let me get to that part.
For the minutes, too, maybe it can be
Dr.
recorded there
Winters.
where we...
Okay. I did take Mr. Madden's challenge seriously. On March 2015, the U.S. Army published the Performance Triad 3 Soldiers Guide, focusing on sleep, nutrition, and exercise as keys to wellness. And I quote, "Disciplined sleep equals survivability, focus, and mental agility."
Okay,
Our new motto.
great.
All right.
Okay.
I have some suggestions on page 6 of the
AR?
AR of the
that
last
they-
document
it's
about
in
the
the
wellness, the wellness AR. I think it would be appropriate to cross out this line that says items to sell, because you can't sell a garage sale. So if you could just put items and leave out that and says suggestions for healthy fundraising include all of those things listed.
Do you see what Dr. Winters is talking about? Okay.
Yes.
And on the final page of that document, I think healthy food celebrations is good, but someplace there has to be listed something about appropriate quantity, because I think you can have animal crackers and they may be good, but it depends on how many of them you eat. So I think appropriate quantities of the food should be somewhere noted, and I'm not sure what is appropriate, but I think that the notion of quantity in nutrition is as important as what you're eating.
But
And-
if this is, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You can interrupt me. I don't mind.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I object to Ms. Goldman's elimination of one of the items on the first page of the wellness guidelines. I think there were a couple of them there. I think the one, maybe it's on the AR, I forget which one it was, where you suggested they leave out, here it is. It's page 1 of 2 of the 272 student wellness policy.
Uh-huh.
Under authority, there are 3 points. And item number 3, you suggested to be eliminated because it was part of physical education courses as part of the lifelong physical activity. Educate students about lifelong physical activity. The reason I have an objection to that is I often hear comments from parents, and I've often seen issues with students who do not get enough recess. And I think recess is clearly a developmentally appropriate physical activity during the school day, which is apart from efforts to educate students for lifelong physical activity. So that's why I would leave it in there. If you want to leave out physical education, I'd leave that out, but I would definitely leave in opportunities for developmentally appropriate physical activity during the school day.
Okay.
One lady's opinion.
Yep.
Such as purposeful.
totally
I
up
don't,
to you.
what do you guys think? I don't have a problem with putting that back in.
Back in,
Yes.
taking out physical education
yes.
courses.
I mean, you can leave that in too, but I want recess.
Opportunities for developmentally appropriate physical activity during the school day. I think then having curriculum programs that are designed, physical education could fall into that category.
Correct, and it says the lifelong physical activity, okay, yes.
Okay.
Yes, because it would be part of the curriculum and programs.
Okay. So you guys are keeping track of all this. I have
Yes.
too many squiggles on my paper.
Just to keep in mind also that recess is specifically called out in the AR under physical activity.
I wanted that.
So,
That doesn't say recess, it says developmentally appropriate physical activity.
On the front page, correct.
On the front
Yeah.
page, and developmentally appropriate, it's very important.
Right. Purposeful play.
No, fun.
So would you have
Purposeful
something
play,
like in
Chuck.
parentheses, e.g. recess, something like that?
Whatever you want, I just want to make sure there's recognition that
That's each
kids
week.
need
Developmental
unstructured
activity.
I think that explains it. I really do. I think that opportunities for developmental appropriate physical activity really describe what we're talking about, because it's not just limited to that recess. As we shared at the kindergarten presentation, there is that purposeful play, and that's integrated into the content of the curriculum area, so.
Super. Okay, so Mrs. Sherry, what are your
I just have
suggestions?
a quick question, because I just am not familiar with what we do now, but what the district does. Do we have vending machines in the district?
Sure.
And what are they
Yes.
stocked with?
In the hallway, I know we do, because I stop and use it every so often. I don't
Are
know.
they stocked with,
I don't know. I would
Healthy.
have to find out. I know that there are. It falls under the USDA snack guidelines. What's in those machines, and there's certain times where they shut off and everything else. So I can explore that for you.
I'm just curious, because I wonder if we follow our policy for wellness in the vending machines. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and thanks, everybody, for a robust policy committee meeting. See you next week, and then again in September.
All right.